Released after 20 years in the dungeon, an elderly returns to the Alpha King's castle and finds. The iron door groaned open, its hinges protesting after 2 decades of silence. Sunlight pierced the darkness like a blade, forcing Edmund Blackwell to shield his eyes with trembling hands. At 63 years old, his body had become a collection of aches and scars, each one a testament to the years stolen from him in the depths of Ravenstone Castle's dungeons. His beard, now completely white and unkempt, reached nearly to his chest, and his once muscular frame had withered to sinew and bone. "Move along, old man," the guard grunted, shoving him forward with the butt of his spear. Edmund stumbled onto the cobblestone courtyard, his legs unsteady beneath him. The world had changed. Even the air tasted different, less like mold and rot, more like pine and autumn leaves. The sky above was impossibly blue, a color so vivid it hurt to look at after years of seeing nothing but gray stone and flickering torchlight. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to remember what freedom felt like. 20 years. 20 winters had passed since King Harold IV had ordered his arrest, accused of treason he never committed. 20 years since he'd last seen his daughter's face, felt his wife's embrace, or walked freely through the halls of the very castle that now loomed before him like a monument to injustice. The castle towers rose against the afternoon sun, but something about them seemed different, less majestic, more weary, as if the stones themselves had aged along with him. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Edmund adjusted the tattered cloak they'd given him, a mockery of charity, threadbare and stained, and began walking toward the village road. His feet, still wrapped in the same rotting boots he'd worn when they'd first dragged him to the dungeons, left small clouds of dust with each uncertain step. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the whisper of unfinished business, or maybe the ghost of the man he used to be. But his feet carried him not toward freedom, but back toward the castle gates. The massive oak doors, carved with the royal seal, seemed to call to him with an irresistible pull. "Where do you think you're going?" Another guard called out, a younger man with suspicious eyes, and a hand already on his sword hilt. "I served King Harold III as royal treasurer for 15 years. Edmund's voice cracked from disuse, the words coming out rough and unfamiliar. "I request an audience with his son." The guards exchanged glances and burst into laughter. "The king doesn't grant audiences to dungeon rats," one sneered, his companion joining in with cruel mirth. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, old man. There's nothing for you here." But an older guard, his face weathered and familiar beneath his helmet, stepped forward. His eyes widened with recognition. "Let him pass. I remember Edmund Blackwell. He was a good man once, honest, fair." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Edmund could hear. "Though I warn you, sir, the castle you remember is not the castle that remains. Much has changed, and not for the better." Edmund nodded his thanks, his throat tight with emotion at being recognized, at being called by his name rather than a number or an insult. He shuffled through the massive oak doors, each step echoing in the entrance hall. The great hall took his breath away, not because of its grandeur, but because of its decay. The once magnificent tapestries that had depicted the kingdom's glorious history hung in tatters, their threads dangling like the remnants of broken promises. The marble floors, which had once gleamed so brightly, servants could see their reflections, were now cracked and stained with years of neglect. Water damage streaked down the walls, and a pervasive dampness clung to everything, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Servants moved like shadows through the corridors, their faces hollow and exhausted, their uniforms patched and faded. They avoided eye contact, heads down, shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow at any moment. The vibrant court Edmund remembered, full of music, laughter, and animated conversation, had been replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by whispers and shuffling feet. "State your business," a voice echoed from the throne, weary and resigned rather than commanding. King Harold IV sat slouched in his father's seat, a man of 40 with the eyes of someone much older. His crown sat slightly askew, as if even it had lost faith in its wearer. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his royal robes, though clean, showed signs of repeated mending. The assembled courtiers looked equally worn, their fine clothes unable to hide the desperation that hung over the court like a shroud. "Your Majesty," Edmund bowed, his joints protesting with sharp pains that shot through his spine. "I am Edmund Blackwell. I served your father faithfully until you were found guilty of embezzling royal funds," the king interrupted, though his tone lacked conviction. The words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd said them before without believing them. "What brings a convicted criminal back to my court? Have you come to gloat? To witness what has become of the kingdom you were accused of betraying?" Edmund straightened as much as his aged spine would allow, meeting the king's eyes directly. "I came seeking the truth, Your Majesty. But I see now that I've found something far more important. A question that needs asking. What happened to this castle? To this kingdom? When I was imprisoned, these halls shone with prosperity. The treasury was full. The people were content. Now I see decay, desperation, and the unmistakable signs of institutional collapse." A murmur rippled through the assembled courtiers, some shocked at his boldness, others nodding in reluctant agreement. The king's face darkened, a flush of shame creeping up his neck. But before he could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "Father?" Edmund's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman who emerged from behind a pillar was in her mid-30s, with his late wife's auburn hair cascading down her back and his own gray eyes staring at him in disbelief. Margaret, his daughter. She'd been 13 when they'd taken him away, a girl on the cusp of womanhood, full of dreams and laughter. Now she was a woman fully grown, with fine lines around her eyes and a bearing that spoke of experience and hardship. "Margaret," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, cutting clean paths through years of dungeon grime. His voice broke on her name, and he reached out with trembling hands before pulling them back, uncertain if he had the right to touch her after so long. She approached slowly, each step measured and cautious, disbelief written across her features. Her hand went to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears that matched his own. "They told me you were dead. 10 years ago, they said you'd died of fever in the dungeons. I mourned you. I visited the chapel every day for a year, praying for your soul. I wore black for 18 months. And you were alive? All this time, you were alive?" "I survived," Edmund managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Though there were many days I wished I hadn't. Days when the darkness seemed preferable to another moment of that existence. But I held on because of you. The memory of your face, your laugh, your spirit. It kept me breathing when I wanted to give up." Margaret's composure cracked entirely. She closed the distance between them and threw her arms around him, not caring about the grime or the smell or the shocked gasps from the courtiers. Edmund embraced her, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms, and for the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to believe that life might hold something other than suffering. The reunion was interrupted by the king's sharp command. "Enough! This is highly irregular. Margaret, return to your chambers. And you, Blackwell, you've seen what you came to see. Now leave before I remember why you were imprisoned in the first place and decide that releasing you was an error in judgment." But Margaret pulled away from her father and stood her ground, wiping her tears, but keeping her chin raised in defiance. "No, Your Majesty. If you'll forgive my boldness, I believe my father deserves answers, as do we all." She gestured to the deteriorating hall around them, her voice gaining strength. This castle is dying. Anyone with eyes can see it. The treasury is empty. We all know it, though we pretend otherwise. The people starve while we maintain the pretense of prosperity. The servants go unpaid for months. The soldiers' equipment is falling apart. The roads are impassable. Perhaps the man you imprisoned 20 years ago, a man who managed the royal finances with integrity and skill, is exactly who we need. The courtiers erupted in whispers, some scandalized by her audacity, others nodding in agreement. A middle-aged Lord Edmund didn't recognize stepped forward. The lady speaks what many of us have been thinking, but lack the courage to say, "Your Majesty, the kingdom teeters on the edge of collapse. Pride and pretense will not save us." The king's expression shifted from anger to something more complex. Shame, perhaps, or exhaustion, or the relief of a man who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for too long. He descended the steps of his throne slowly, each footfall echoing in the vast space. When he reached Edmund, he studied the old man's face for a long moment, taking in the scars, the premature aging, the eyes that had seen too much darkness. "My father told me on his deathbed that imprisoning you was his greatest regret," the king said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the silent hall. "He said the evidence against you had been fabricated by Thomas Whitmore, his chief advisor, who was himself stealing from the treasury. By the time father discovered the truth, Whitmore had fled to the northern territories with enough gold to live like a prince, and you had been in the dungeons for 5 years. Father was too proud to admit his mistake publicly, so he let you rot. He told himself that releasing you would undermine confidence in the crown, that admitting error would weaken the monarchy. And when I inherited the throne, I inherited his shame, along with his crown. I told myself I would right this wrong, but years passed, and I found reason after reason to delay, until now." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Edmund felt his anger, nursed so carefully through 20 winters, fed by every cold night and hungry day, kept alive by the injustice of his situation, begin to crack. Not disappear, but crack, allowing other emotions to seep through. Confusion, grief, a tentative flicker of something that might, eventually, become understanding. "Why tell me this now?" Edmund asked, his voice hoarse. "Why release me at all? Why not let me die down there, forgotten? Another victim of political convenience." "Because I'm tired," Harold IV admitted, and the rawness in his voice silenced the courtiers completely. "I'm tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of watching this kingdom crumble while I maintain the fiction that everything is fine. Margaret is right. This kingdom is dying, and I don't know how to save it." Thomas Whitmore's corruption went deeper than anyone realized. He'd been embezzling funds for years, creating false ledgers, bribing officials, establishing networks of corruption that outlasted his presence. When I finally discovered the extent of the damage, the treasury was already depleted. I've spent 15 years trying to rebuild what he destroyed, but I'm no treasurer. I have no head for numbers, no understanding of the complex systems that keep a kingdom functioning. I'm barely a king, more like a man wearing a crown and hoping no one notices he doesn't know what he's doing. Harold IV's vulnerability was shocking. This was not the tyrannical ruler Edmund had imagined during his years of captivity, the monster he'd constructed in his mind to justify his hatred. This was a man drowning under the weight of inherited sins, struggling to breathe beneath the crushing responsibility of a crown he'd never been prepared to wear. "You want my help," Edmund said, not quite a question, his mind racing to comprehend the enormity of what was being asked. "I'm begging for it," the king corrected, his voice breaking slightly. "Not as your sovereign, but as a man who watched his father's mistakes poison everything he touched. I can't give you back 20 years, Edmund Blackwell. I can't restore your wife. She died 8 years ago, and I'm sorry you weren't there to say goodbye. I can't erase the scars on your body or the nightmares I imagine plague your sleep. But I can offer you the chance to save a kingdom that desperately needs saving. I can give you the authority to do what should have been done years ago. And I can ensure that your name is cleared, your honor restored, and the truth finally told." Edmund looked at his daughter, who nodded encouragingly, tears still glistening on her cheeks. He looked at the decaying hall, at the desperate faces of the courtiers, at the king who'd finally found the courage to face an old injustice. He thought of the dungeon cell that had been his home for 20 years, the darkness that had nearly consumed him, the anger that had kept him alive when hope had died. And he thought of the man he'd been before, Edmund Blackwell, royal treasurer, a man who'd believed in service, in duty, in the ideal that those with power had an obligation to use it wisely. That man had been imprisoned, tortured by time and isolation. But had he died? Or was he still here, somewhere beneath the scars and rage? "I'll need full access to the financial records," Edmund said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Complete authority to investigate expenditures, question officials, and restructure the treasury operations. I'll need staff, people I can trust, not remnants of the corrupt system. And I'll need my name cleared publicly, not just whispered acknowledgement in private chambers. If I do this, the truth must be told openly, regardless of who it embarrasses or what it reveals about the crown." "Done," Harold Fort agreed without hesitation. "All of it. Whatever you need. Though I warn you, what you'll find won't be pleasant. The rot runs deep, deeper than you can imagine. There are officials who've been stealing for years. Nobles who've been siphoning funds meant for public works into their private estates. Military commanders who've been inflating their supply needs and selling the excess. The corruption has metastasized until I can barely tell who's honest and who's simply better at hiding their crimes." "Then we'll cut it all out," Edmund said grimly. "Every bit of rot, no matter how high it reaches." Over the following days, Edmund began to understand the full scope of the disaster. The castle's decline was merely the visible symptom of a systemic collapse that affected every aspect of the kingdom's administration. Harold IV assigned him a small office in the treasury wing, the same office Edmund had occupied 20 years ago, though now dusty and filled with stacks of poorly organized documents. Margaret insisted on helping, despite Edmund's initial protests. "I've spent my adult life serving this court," she told him firmly. "I know its secrets. I know which officials can be trusted and which ones are corrupt. I know where the money flows and where it disappears. You need me, Father, whether you want to admit it or not." She was right, of course. While Edmund had knowledge and experience, he'd been absent for 20 years. The political landscape had shifted, old alliances had crumbled and new ones had formed, and many of the people he'd once known were dead or retired. Margaret became his eyes and ears, his guide through a court that was familiar, yet foreign. Their first task was to examine the financial records. What they found was catastrophic. The ledgers were a disaster. Pages missing, numbers that didn't add up, entries written in different hands without explanation. Some records had been deliberately destroyed, leaving gaps in the financial history that made comprehensive analysis nearly impossible. "This is worse than I imagined," Edmund muttered one evening, his eyes burning from hours of reviewing documents by candlelight. His aged eyes struggled with the small script, and he often needed Margaret to read entries aloud. "It's not just theft. It's complete institutional breakdown. These records are so corrupted I can't tell what's real and what's fabricated." "Start with what you can verify," Margaret suggested, setting down another stack of documents. She'd proven remarkably adept at deciphering the mess, her years at court giving her insights into which officials might have been involved in which schemes. The military expenditures, for instance. We can cross-reference those with actual troop numbers and equipment inventories. They worked late into the night, Edmund's old training coming back to him despite the years of disuse. Numbers that should have matched revealed discrepancies. Expenses that should have been documented were mysteriously absent. And gradually, A picture emerged of an administration riddled with incompetence and corruption at every level. "How did it get this bad?" Edmund asked, rubbing his tired eyes. The headache that had been building all day had become a persistent throb at his temples. "Slowly, then all at once," Margaret replied, her own exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. After Whitmore fled, the king appointed his childhood friend Gerald Morris as treasurer. Gerald was loyal but hopeless with numbers. He trusted the wrong people, ignored warning signs, and by the time anyone realized the mistake, Gerald had died of a heart ailment. His successor was Marcus Thornberry, who was even worse, actively corrupt, rather than merely incompetent. And so it continued, each one less effective than the last, each one taking advantage of the chaos to line their own pockets. Edmund nodded grimly. The foundation was already cracked. Each new treasurer just added more weight until the whole structure began to crumble. But Whitmore, he must have planned this. You don't create a system this corrupt accidentally. He built it deliberately, with redundancies and protections that allowed it to continue even after he was gone. "Can you fix it?" Margaret's voice held hope and fear in equal measure. Edmund was silent for a long moment, staring at the mountain of corrupted records before him. "I don't know," he admitted. "This isn't just about finding stolen money or prosecuting corrupt officials. The entire system needs to be rebuilt from the foundation up. That takes time, resources, and political will. It means making enemies of powerful people. It means exposing uncomfortable truths that the court would prefer to keep hidden. Are you prepared for that? Is the king?" "I am," Margaret said without hesitation, "and I believe Harold is too. He's tired of pretending." "So am I. So are many others. The question is, are you prepared? You've already lost 20 years. Are you willing to spend however many years you have left fighting this battle?" Edmund thought of his dungeon cell, of the darkness and cold, of the slow passage of time marked only by meals pushed through a slot in the door. He thought of his wife, dead and buried while he'd been unable to attend her funeral or mourn her properly. He thought of Margaret's childhood and young adulthood, moments he'd missed forever. Those years were gone, stolen by injustice and pride and corruption. He could take his freedom and disappear, find a cottage somewhere, live out his remaining years in peace. No one would blame him. He'd earned the right to rest, to turn his back on the kingdom that had turned its back on him. But if he did that, what would those 20 years mean? They would simply be lost time, wasted suffering with no purpose or redemption. But if he stayed, if he fought to fix this broken kingdom, then maybe, just maybe, those years could become something more. Not justified, never that, but at least transformed into something meaningful. "I'll fight," he said quietly. "Not because I've forgiven them, but because someone has to. And because I want my granddaughter to inherit a kingdom worth living in." Margaret smiled through fresh tears. "Grandchildren, actually. I have 3. 2 girls and a boy. I've been afraid to introduce them to you. Afraid you'd hate them for existing in a world you were denied access to." "I could never hate them," Edmund said firmly. "When can I meet them?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. They've been asking about you since they heard the news. I've told them stories about their grandfather, the man who once managed the kingdom's finances with such skill that the realm prospered. They're excited to meet you." The thought of grandchildren, family he'd never known existed, filled Edmund with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. The investigation intensified over the following weeks. Edmund and Margaret worked methodically through the records, identifying patterns of corruption and building cases against specific officials. The deeper they dug, the more horrified Edmund became. It wasn't just a few corrupt individuals. It was a network that extended throughout the administration. Lord Pemberton, who Edmund remembered as an idealistic young knight, had been accepting bribes to overlook faulty construction on royal buildings. When those buildings inevitably needed repairs, he'd accepted more bribes to approve contracts with inflated costs. Lady Catherine's cousin, Jonathan Mercer, had been inflating supply costs for the castle's kitchens for over a decade, pocketing the difference. Even some of the guards who'd shown Edmund kindness were implicated in small-scale theft, taking extra rations, selling information, looking the other way when merchants shortchanged the crown. The hardest discovery came when Edmund found evidence that his own arrest had been more convenient than he'd realized. Yes, Whitmore had fabricated evidence. But King Harold III had been eager to believe it because Edmund had been asking too many questions about certain expenditures that benefited some of the king's closest friends. His imprisonment hadn't been merely a mistake or even a malicious frame job. It had been partly intentional, a way to silence an inconveniently thorough treasurer who was getting too close to uncomfortable truths. "You should hate us all," Margaret said when he shared this revelation with her one evening. They were in his office, the candles burning low, the castle quiet around them. "You should have taken your freedom and never looked back. I wouldn't have blamed you. I still don't blame you if you want to leave now." Edmund was silent for a long moment, staring at the ledger that proved his imprisonment had served multiple purposes. The anger he felt was different now, colder, more calculated, less consuming. "I wanted to," he finally said, "standing in that courtyard, with sunlight on my face for the first time in 20 years. All I wanted was to disappear into the countryside and forget this place existed. I imagined finding a small cottage, maybe getting work as a bookkeeper for some merchant, living out my days in anonymity and peace." "What stopped you?" "You," he said simply. "The memory of you. The hope that maybe, somehow, I could find you again. And then I saw the castle, saw what it had become, and I realized something. If I walked away, then they won. All of them. Whitmore, King Harold III, the corrupt officials, the lie that destroyed my life. They would have succeeded in silencing me, in burying the truth, in ensuring their crimes never faced consequences. But if I stayed, if I fought to fix this broken kingdom, then maybe those 20 years could mean something after all. Maybe I could prevent them from destroying anyone else the way they destroyed me." Margaret embraced him then, and for the first time since his release, Edmund allowed himself to feel something other than anger or determination. He felt hope, fragile and tentative, but real. The confrontations that followed were brutal. Edmund presented his findings to King Harold IV in a series of private meetings, each one revealing another layer of institutional decay. The king's face grew grayer with each revelation, the weight of his inheritance becoming more apparent. But to his credit, Harold never tried to hide from the truth or protect his friends at the expense of justice. "Some of these people are my friends," Harold said one afternoon, reviewing a list of officials Edmund recommended for dismissal or prosecution. His finger traced down the names, people he'd known since childhood, people who'd supported him when he'd inherited the throne, people he'd trusted. "Lord Pemberton was at my coronation. Lady Catherine helped arrange my marriage. Jonathan Mercer saved my life during a hunting accident when I was 16. "I know," Edmund replied, his voice not unkind but unyielding. "Some of them were my friends too once upon a time. But friendship doesn't excuse corruption. Loyalty doesn't justify theft. If we exempt people because of personal connections, then we're no better than those who came before us. The rot will simply continue, hidden beneath a layer of fresh paint." The king made the difficult decisions. Corrupt officials were removed from their positions, some immediately, others after careful investigation confirmed their crimes. Some were prosecuted in public trials that shocked the kingdom. Others were simply dismissed with warnings, their crimes too minor or too difficult to prove beyond doubt. The court buzzed with resentment and fear. Powerful families protested. Nobles threatened to withdraw their support. But Edmund remained unmoved. "Let them protest," he told Margaret when she brought news of another angry letter from an influential family. "Their anger is proof we're doing what needs to be done. Comfortable people don't get angry about change. Only those benefiting from the current system fight to preserve it." But the backlash was more than just protests and angry letters. One night, as Edmund walked from his office to his quarters, someone shoved him from behind. He fell hard, his aged body unable to catch itself, and felt a rib crack on impact. A hooded figure stood over him, and Edmund braced for the killing blow. But instead, the figure simply whispered, "Leave, while you still can," and disappeared into the shadows. Margaret found him moments later, having heard the commotion. She insisted on staying with him through the night, despite his protests that he was fine. "You're not fine," she said firmly, helping him to his bed. "And you're not alone anymore. Whoever did this, whoever wants you gone, they'll have to go through me." The attack changed something in the castle. Those who'd been quietly supporting Edmund's reforms became more vocal. The king assigned guards to protect him, despite Edmund's grumbling that he didn't need babysitters. And the investigation took on a new urgency. Someone was threatened enough by what they were discovering to resort to violence. That meant they were close to something important. 3 days later, Edmund found it. Hidden in a set of military supply records was a pattern of purchases that made no sense. Orders for equipment that was never delivered, payments to suppliers who didn't exist, shipments that disappeared without explanation. When he cross-referenced these records with Margaret's knowledge of military personnel, a name emerged: General Marcus Rothwell, commander of the Northern Garrison and one of King Harold IV's most trusted advisors. "This can't be right," Margaret said, reviewing Edmund's calculations. "General Rothwell has been advising the king since before his coronation. He's a war hero. He saved the Northern Territories from bandits. The king trusts him completely." "Then the king has been deceived," Edmund replied grimly. "Look at these numbers. Over the past 10 years, Rothwell has requisitioned enough equipment to outfit an army 3 times the size of what he actually commands. Either he's stockpiling weapons for some purpose, or he's been selling them. Either way, it's theft on a massive scale." Presenting this evidence to King Harold IV was one of the hardest things Edmund had done since his release. The king listened in stunned silence as Edmund laid out the case against Rothwell, page after page of falsified records, inflated requisitions, and suspicious transactions. When Edmund finished, Harold sat motionless for several minutes, his face ashen. "Marcus has been my friend for 20 years, the king finally said, his voice hollow. "He stood beside me when my father died. He helped me navigate those first difficult months. I trusted him with the defense of our northern border. Are you certain?" "I'm certain of the numbers," Edmund replied. "What they mean. Whether General Rothwell is acting alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. Whether he's selling the equipment or storing it for some other purpose. That requires further investigation. But the theft itself is undeniable." Harold IV made the difficult decision to summon Rothwell back to the castle under the pretense of a strategic meeting. When the general arrived 3 days later, confident and unsuspecting, the king confronted him with the evidence. Edmund watched from a corner of the throne room as Rothwell's confidence crumbled. The general tried to bluster, then to deflect, then to justify. But faced with undeniable proof, he finally admitted the truth. "I wasn't stealing for myself," Rothwell said, his voice desperate. "The treasury was empty. My men needed equipment. I couldn't let them face bandits with broken swords and rotting armor. So I started improvising. I'd requisition more than I needed and sell the excess to neighboring kingdoms. The money went straight back into properly equipping my garrison. I didn't keep a single coin for myself." "You still stole from the crown," Edmund said quietly. "You falsified records. You lied to your king. Your intentions may have been good, but but your methods were corrupt. And in doing so, you perpetuated the very system that created the problem in the first place. Rothwell was stripped of his command and imprisoned, though not in the same dungeons that had held Edmund. Harold IV, despite his anger and betrayal, ensured the general was treated with a degree of dignity Edmund had never received. It was a small gesture, but Edmund noticed it. The king was trying to break the cycle, to be better than his father had been. The general's exposure sent shockwaves through the administration. If even someone as trusted as Rothwell could be corrupt, then no one was above suspicion. Officials scrambled to hide evidence of their own crimes, or in some cases, to come forward and confess before they were discovered. Edmund offered amnesty to those who volunteered information, not forgiveness, but reduced consequences in exchange for cooperation. Slowly, painfully, a clearer picture emerged. The corruption wasn't centralized or organized. It was diffuse, a cancer that had spread through every organ of the administration. Some officials stole for greed. Others, like Rothwell, stole out of desperation or misguided good intentions. Many simply followed established practices without questioning whether those practices were legal or ethical. The system had normalized corruption to the point where honest behavior seemed naive or even harmful. "How do you rebuild trust when everyone has been complicit?" Margaret asked one evening. They'd been working for 3 months now, and while progress was being made, the scope of the problem seemed to grow with each new discovery. "You don't rebuild trust quickly," Edmund replied, his voice tired. He was exhausted, physically from the long hours, emotionally from constantly confronting betrayal and disappointment. Trust is built slowly, through consistent action over time. We establish new systems with proper oversight. We train people in ethical practices. We hold everyone accountable, regardless of rank or connections. And we accept that some people will never trust the administration again, because we've given them no reason to. That could take years, decades. Yes, Edmund agreed. It probably will. But the alternative is to give up, to accept corruption as inevitable, to resign ourselves to institutional decay. I spent 20 years in a dungeon because the system failed. I won't spend whatever years I have left watching that failure continue unchallenged. Restructuring the treasury was like rebuilding a house from the foundation up while people were still living in it. Edmund couldn't simply tear down the existing system. The kingdom needed to function while reforms were implemented. So he worked methodically, replacing one component at a time, always ensuring that critical operations continued even as he exposed and eliminated corruption. He implemented new accounting procedures that required multiple signatures and regular audits. He established checks and balances, ensuring that no single person had too much authority over financial decisions. He created a training program for new treasury clerks, emphasizing not just technical skills but ethical principles. And he insisted on transparency, making financial reports available to the nobility, and in simplified form, to the common people. The resistance was fierce. Officials complained about the new procedures being too cumbersome. Nobles protested the loss of privacy regarding their tax payments. Even some honest administrators grumbled about the increased workload and scrutiny. But Edmund was unmovable. "Transparency is uncomfortable for those who've grown accustomed to operating in shadows," he told a group of protesting officials. "Yes, the new procedures require more work. Yes, you're being held to higher standards. But that's the point. The old way failed. If we want different results, we need different methods." Margaret proved invaluable during this transformation. Her years at court had given her insights into the political dynamics that Edmund, despite his experience, couldn't fully grasp after 20 years away. She knew which nobles would respond to appeals to duty, and which would only cooperate under threat. She understood the informal power structures that existed beneath the official hierarchy. And she had a gift for diplomacy that softened Edmund's sometimes harsh directness. "You can't just tell Lord Ashford he's an idiot, father," she said after one particularly contentious meeting. "Even if he is one." "Why not?" Edmund asked, genuinely confused. He proposed a budget allocation that makes no mathematical sense. Calling attention to that seems relevant. Because Lord Ashford controls 3 major trade routes and employs 200 people. We need his cooperation, which means we need to give him a way to accept the changes without losing face. You explain why his proposal won't work, offer an alternative, and let him present it as his own idea. He gets credit, we get reform. Everyone wins. Edmund grumbled, but recognized the wisdom in her approach. He'd spent 20 years in a dungeon where direct confrontation was the only language anyone understood. Adjusting back to the subtle negotiations of court life was harder than he'd anticipated. 6 months into the reforms, the kingdom began to show signs of recovery. The treasury, while not full, was at least no longer hemorrhaging gold. Tax collection improved as people began to trust that their payments would actually fund public services rather than disappearing into corrupt pockets. The castle staff received their first full wages in over a year. Roads began receiving repairs. The most urgent military needs were addressed, but the personal cost was high. Edmund's health, never robust after 20 years of deprivation, deteriorated under the stress. He developed a persistent cough that Margaret insisted was serious despite his protests. His eyesight, already weakened by years in darkness, continued to fade. Some days, the pain in his joints was so severe he could barely hold a quill. "You're killing yourself," Margaret told him bluntly one evening, when she found him still working at midnight, his hands shaking from exhaustion. "Father, you've done enough. Let others take over some of this work." "I can't," Edmund replied, not looking up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Not yet. The systems aren't stable enough. If I step back now, everything could collapse." "Then train someone," she insisted. "Train multiple someones. You've always said the goal was to build something that didn't depend on any one person. But you're still trying to do everything yourself." She was right, of course. Edmund had been so focused on the immediate work that he'd neglected the longer-term goal of creating sustainable systems. So he began training a new generation of treasury administrators, young men and women who'd grown up during the years of corruption and were hungry for something better. He taught them not just technical skills, but principles, the importance of accuracy, the necessity of integrity, the courage to speak truth to power even when it was inconvenient. Among these students was a young woman named Alice Thornton, the daughter of one of the corrupt officials Edmund had exposed. She'd approached him hesitantly, expecting rejection. But Edmund saw in her the same determination he'd once felt as a young man entering royal service. "I can't change what my father did," she told him during their first meeting. "But I can choose to be different. I want to learn to do this work properly, to serve with honor." Edmund accepted her into the program, and she proved to be his most dedicated student. She absorbed information like a sponge, asked insightful questions, and demonstrated an ethical framework that gave him hope for the future. Within a year, she was capable of handling complex audits independently. Within 2 years, he trusted her judgment as much as his own. "You remind me of myself at your age," Edmund told her one afternoon as they reviewed quarterly reports, "before I became cynical, before I learned that idealism can be dangerous in a corrupt system." "Are you still cynical?" Alice asked. Edmund considered the question. "Less than I was," he admitted. "Working with people like you, people who genuinely want to do good work, has restored some of my faith in human nature. Not all of it. Maybe never all of it. But enough to keep going." Meanwhile, King Harold IV was undergoing his own transformation. The weak, uncertain ruler who'd first summoned Edmund had gradually become more confident, more decisive. The act of confronting corruption, of making difficult decisions, had strengthened him. He began attending treasury meetings, asking informed questions, understanding the financial implications of policy decisions. He was learning to be the king his father had never been. "I should have done this years ago," Harold confessed to Edmund during one such meeting. "I should have investigated when I first suspected problems. But I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd find. Afraid of making enemies. afraid of proving I wasn't capable of ruling. So I did nothing, and the problems grew worse. Fear is a natural response to overwhelming responsibility, Edmund replied. But leadership means acting despite fear, not in its absence. You're doing that now. That's what matters. The relationship between Edmund and the king had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Not quite friendship, but mutual respect built on shared purpose. Harold had stolen 20 years from Edmund's life through inaction and cowardice. That couldn't be forgiven easily or quickly. But the king was genuinely trying to be better, to break the cycle of corruption and pride that had defined his father's reign. Edmund could acknowledge that effort, even while carrying the scars of past injustice. 2 years after his release, Edmund stood once again in the Great Hall, but this time for a ceremony. King Harold IV had declared a day of accountability, a public acknowledgement of the administration's failures and the reforms being implemented. Officials who'd been found corrupt had their crimes read aloud. Those who'd been dismissed or prosecuted were named, and Edmund's own wrongful imprisonment was discussed in detail, without euphemism or excuse. Edmund Blackwell was imprisoned for 20 years for crimes he did not commit, Harold IV declared before the assembled court, and a crowd of common citizens allowed special entry for the occasion. He suffered because my father was too proud to admit error, and because I was too weak to correct it quickly. This is not ancient history that we can ignore or minimize. This is a wound that our administration inflicted on an innocent man. We cannot restore the years stolen from him. We cannot undo the suffering he endured. But we can acknowledge the truth, clear his name completely, and ensure that such injustice never happens again. The king descended from his throne and approached Edmund, who stood with Margaret beside him. Edmund Blackwell, I hereby restore all honors, titles, and privileges wrongfully stripped from you. I declare your record cleared of all criminal accusations, and I offer, on behalf of the crown, a formal apology for the injustice you suffered. Then, to everyone's shock, Harold IV removed his crown and bowed deeply to Edmund. It was an unprecedented gesture, a king bowing to a subject, humbling himself before the man he'd wronged. The hall fell into absolute silence. Edmund felt tears threaten, but he blinked them back. 20 years of anger and pain, 2 years of exhausting labor, all crystallizing into this moment of public acknowledgement. It didn't make things right. Nothing could do that. But it was something. It was truth spoken aloud, injustice named and condemned, a promise that the future would be better than the past. I accept your apology, Your Majesty, Edmund said quietly, and I acknowledge your courage in offering it. That alone breaks the cycle that imprisoned me. Your father never could have done this. Harold IV straightened, replacing his crown with hands that trembled slightly. Will you continue serving as royal treasurer? Not because I command it, but because this kingdom still needs your guidance? Edmund glanced at Margaret, who smiled encouragingly. He thought of the small cottage he'd once imagined, the quiet retirement he'd dreamed of during his darkest days. Then he thought of Alice Thornton and the other young administrators he'd trained, of the systems he'd built that still needed protecting, of the foundation that remained fragile despite 2 years of repairs. I'll serve, he said finally. For a few more years at least. Until the reforms are stable enough to survive without me. Until the people I've trained are ready to take over. Until I'm confident that what we've built will last. Then it's settled, the king declared, his voice stronger now. He turned to Margaret. Lady Margaret Ashford, your assistance has been invaluable to these reforms. Your knowledge, diplomacy, and dedication have been essential to our success. Would you consent to serving as deputy treasurer, with the understanding that you will eventually succeed your father in the role? Margaret's eyes widened. Women rarely held such positions, and the position of deputy treasurer had never been offered to anyone, male or female. But she didn't hesitate. I would be honored, Your Majesty. The ceremony concluded with the public reading of new financial procedures and accountability measures. It was boring to most of the assembled crowd, dry lists of rules and regulations, but Edmund saw it differently. Those procedures represented structure, oversight, the institutional barriers against corruption that had been absent for so long. They weren't exciting, but they were essential. That evening, Margaret organized a small celebration. Just family. Edmund met his 3 grandchildren properly for the first time. Eleanor, who was 9 and already showing an aptitude for mathematics. Thomas, who was 7 and more interested in stories than numbers. And little Catherine, who was 5 and mostly interested in climbing everything. "Tell us about the dungeon, grandfather," Thomas asked with the morbid curiosity of children everywhere. "Thomas," Margaret scolded. "That's inappropriate." But Edmund raised a hand. "It's all right." He looked at his grandson, considering how to answer. "The dungeon was dark and cold. I spent 20 years there, and there were many days I thought I wouldn't survive. But I did survive, because I held on to hope. Hope that someday I'd see your mother again. Hope that justice might eventually prevail. Hope that I might get to meet wonderful grandchildren like you 3. "Were you scared?" Eleanor asked. "Every day," Edmund admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means acting despite fear, doing what's right even when it's difficult. That's a lesson I learned in the darkness, and it's one I hope you'll remember." Catherine, not understanding most of the conversation, simply climbed onto Edmund's lap and declared, "I love you, grandfather." Those simple words, spoken with childish sincerity, broke something in Edmund. He wrapped his arms around his youngest granddaughter and allowed himself to weep, not from anger or grief, but from relief, from the profound realization that despite everything stolen from him, he still had this: family, purpose, a reason to keep fighting. The following years were marked by steady progress. The financial reforms Edmund had implemented took root, supported by a new generation of administrators who'd been trained in his principles. The kingdom's economy stabilized, then began to grow. Tax revenues increased not through higher rates, but through better collection and reduced corruption. Public works projects resumed. The military received proper funding and equipment through legitimate channels. But Edmund's health continued to decline. The persistent cough developed into a chronic respiratory condition that left him frequently breathless. His vision deteriorated to the point where he needed Margaret or Alice to read most documents aloud. The pain in his joints became constant, managed only by increasingly strong medicines that left him foggy-headed. "You should rest," Margaret told him repeatedly. "You've done what you set out to do. The kingdom is recovering. The systems are stable. Let others handle the day-to-day work." Edmund knew she was right. He was 70 now, his body failing in ways that even determination couldn't overcome. But letting go was harder than he'd anticipated. The work had become his purpose, his redemption, the thing that made his suffering meaningful. Without it, what was he? The decision was ultimately made for him. One morning, Edmund woke to find he couldn't get out of bed. His body simply refused to cooperate, as if his muscles had gone on strike. Margaret summoned the royal physician, who examined him thoroughly before delivering a gentle but firm verdict. Edmund's body had been pushed beyond its limits. He needed complete rest, or he risked dying within months. "I don't want to die in bed," Edmund protested weakly, "not after surviving 20 years in a dungeon." "Then you'll do as the physician orders," Margaret replied firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Father, you've fought enough battles. You've earned the right to rest." So Edmund reluctantly stepped back from active duty, though he remained involved as an advisor. Alice Thornton was promoted to acting treasurer, with Margaret continuing as deputy. Edmund watched from his chambers as they handled the work he'd once done, and he felt both pride and melancholy. Pride that his students had learned so well. melancholy that his active involvement was ending not by choice, but by physical necessity. But retirement gave him something he hadn't had in years: time. Time with his grandchildren, who visited regularly to hear stories or simply sit with him. Time to reflect on his life, to process the trauma of his imprisonment and the exhaustion of his recovery. Time to rest, finally, after decades of either suffering or fighting. One afternoon, King Harold IV visited Edmund's chambers. The king was graying now, too, the weight of his responsibilities visible in the lines on his face. But he carried himself with a confidence that had been absent when Edmund first returned. "I wanted to thank you," Harold said, settling into a chair beside Edmund's bed. "Not just for fixing the treasury, though that was invaluable, but for showing me what leadership actually means. My father ruled through pride and fear. You've taught me to rule through honesty and accountability. That's a far greater gift than financial expertise." "You've been a good student," Edmund replied, his voice raspier than it used to be. "Better than your father. Better than you believed you could be." "Do you think we've succeeded?" Harold asked. "Have we broken the cycle?" Edmund considered the question carefully. "We've damaged it, certainly. The reforms we've implemented make widespread corruption much harder. The culture is changing, slowly, but changing. But cycles this deep don't break easily. There will always be people who try to exploit the system, who prioritize personal gain over public service. Eternal vigilance is the price of institutional integrity. That's exhausting to contemplate," Harold said with a tired smile. "Yes," Edmund agreed, "but it's also necessary. The moment we declare victory and stop watching is the moment the rot begins again. That's why training the next generation is so important. They need to understand not just the mechanics of good governance, but its fragility." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who'd been brought together by injustice, and had somehow forged something meaningful from that painful connection. "I still carry the guilt," Harold finally said. "Every time I see you struggle to breathe, every time I'm reminded of your failing health, I remember that you're dying from conditions created by 20 years in a dungeon, conditions I had the power to end but didn't, because I was too cowardly to face my father's mistakes." "Guilt can be useful if it motivates change," Edmund replied. "But don't let it consume you. You've made amends as best anyone could. You've become the king you needed to be. That's enough." "Is it?" Harold asked. "Is it enough for you?" Edmund thought about the question honestly. Was it enough? Could anything be enough to compensate for 20 lost years? For missing his wife's final days? For the grandchildren he'd never seen born? "No," he admitted. "It's not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it's something. It's acknowledgement, apology, effort toward justice. That's more than most people wronged by power ever receive. So I'll accept it, not as full restitution, but as a genuine attempt at making things better. That's all any of us can do, make genuine attempts. We're all imperfect people in imperfect systems, doing our imperfect best." Harold IV nodded, seeming to find some peace in Edmund's words. Before he left, he clasped Edmund's hand firmly. "When you pass, and I hope that day is far in the future, I want to commission a monument. Not just to honor you, but to remind future generations what happens when institutions fail their people. Would you object to that?" "I'd prefer you invest the money in training more treasury clerks," Edmund said dryly. "But do what you think necessary. Just make sure the inscription is honest. No sanitizing the truth to make anyone look better. If future generations are going to learn from this, they need the full story, the corruption, the injustice, the failure, and the effort to do better." "It will be honest," Harold promised. "I've learned that much, at least." Edmund lived another 3 years in semi-retirement, his body slowly failing but his mind remaining sharp until near the end. He spent those years surrounded by family, watching his grandchildren grow, offering guidance when asked, but no longer carrying the weight of daily administration. Margaret and Alice ran the treasury with skill and integrity that made him profoundly proud. The kingdom continued its slow recovery, building on the foundations he'd helped establish. During those final years, Edmund also worked with the royal historian to document everything, not just the financial corruption and reforms, but the human cost. The historian recorded hours of conversations with Edmund about his imprisonment, about the psychological toll of isolation and injustice, about how institutional failure affects real people in real ways. These accounts would become required reading for future administrators, a reminder that their decisions affected lives beyond numbers in ledgers. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day of his release years earlier, Edmund woke, knowing his time was near. He'd developed an instinct for such things during his dungeon years, an awareness of his body's limits that most people never acquired. He asked Margaret to gather the family, and they came. Margaret and her children, now teenagers and a young woman. Alice Thornton, who'd become like a second daughter to him. Several of the treasury clerks he'd trained, and King Harold IV himself. "I'm not good at sentimental speeches," Edmund said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to say some things while I still can." They gathered closer, and Edmund looked at each face, committing them to memory for whatever came next. "Margaret, you've given me more joy in these last few years than I thought possible after everything that happened. You've proven yourself not just as my daughter, but as a capable leader who'll carry on this work better than I ever could. I'm proud of you in ways I can't adequately express." Margaret was crying openly, holding his hand tightly. "Alice, you came to me carrying your father's shame, and you've transformed it into honor through your own integrity. You represent everything I hope to build, a new generation that understands both the mechanics of good governance and its moral foundations. Keep training others the way I trained you. Keep asking the uncomfortable questions. Keep demanding better." Alice nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Edmund looked at his grandchildren. Eleanor was 18 now, already working in the treasury as a junior clerk. Thomas had become a scholar, studying history and law. Catherine was 13, still deciding her path, but showing interest in diplomacy. "You three never knew me during my years of strength," Edmund told them. "You've only seen an old man weakened by suffering and age. But I hope I've shown you something important. That suffering doesn't have to define you. That injustice doesn't have to produce only bitterness. That it's possible to build something meaningful even from ruins. Carry that forward. Be better than the generation before you, as every generation should strive to be." Finally, he turned to King Harold IV, who'd been standing slightly apart from the others, his face grave. "Your Majesty, you asked me once if what you'd done was enough. I told you it wasn't, but that it was something. I stand by that assessment. You've become a good king, not a perfect one, but one who tries genuinely to serve his people rather than exploit them. Continue that effort. Protect the reforms we've built. Train your successor to value integrity over convenience. And remember that admitting mistakes is a sign of strength, not weakness. That single lesson might be your greatest legacy." Harold IV bowed his head, visibly struggling with emotion. "I will, Edmund. I promise you I will." Edmund felt his energy fading, his breath becoming more labored. But there was one more thing he needed to say. Something for all of them. "I spent 20 years in darkness, wondering if my suffering had meaning, if justice would ever prevail, if anyone would remember or care about what had been done to me. Standing here now, surrounded by people I love and who love me, seeing the kingdom recovering from institutional rot, knowing that the work we've done will outlast all of us, I can finally say that those years, while unjust and terrible, were not meaningless. We transformed that injustice into something better. That's all any of us can hope to do with our pain. Transform it, use it, make it mean something beyond itself." He paused, gathering his remaining strength for his final words. "Don't let the cycle repeat. Stay vigilant. Hold each other accountable. Demand integrity from your leaders and from yourselves. And remember that institutions are only as strong as the people who maintain them. Each of you has the power to either perpetuate corruption or resist it. Choose resistance, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Edmund closed his eyes, suddenly overwhelmingly tired. He felt Margaret's hand in his, heard the quiet weeping of those gathered around him, sensed the presence of his family in a way that filled him with peace. His last coherent thought was not of the dungeon or the years of suffering. It was of Eleanor's laugh, Thomas's curiosity, Catherine's fierce hugs. It was of Margaret's strength and Alice's dedication. It was of the young clerks in the treasury, learning to value accuracy and honesty above convenience. It was of a kingdom slowly healing, systems slowly working, people slowly learning to trust again. Edmund Blackwell died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by love, his work incomplete, but his contribution undeniable. He was 75 years old, 20 of those years stolen, but the remaining 55 lived with purpose and meaning. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by nobles and commoners alike. King Harold IV delivered a eulogy that was brutally honest about the crown's failures and Edmund's grace in responding to them. Margaret spoke about her father's resilience and love. Alice talked about his dedication to teaching and his vision for institutional integrity. Even some of the officials Edmund had exposed and dismissed came to pay their respects, acknowledging that his actions, while painful for them, had been necessary for the kingdom. The monument Harold IV commissioned was placed in the Treasury courtyard, where every administrator would see it daily. The inscription read, "Edmund Blackwell, Royal Treasurer, wrongfully imprisoned for 20 years, returned to save the kingdom that had betrayed him. His suffering reminds us that institutional failure affects real lives. His response reminds us that we can choose to build rather than destroy, to reform rather than accept corruption, to demand justice rather than perpetuate injustice. May all who serve here remember, we are stewards, not masters. We are accountable, not exempt. We are human, not infallible. Eternal vigilance is the price of institutional integrity." Margaret succeeded Edmund as royal treasurer, serving with distinction for another 23 years. She continued his reforms, expanded the training programs, and became known as one of the most effective administrators in the kingdom's history. Alice served as her deputy, eventually succeeding her when Margaret retired. Eleanor, Edmund's eldest grandchild, also joined the treasury, creating a multi-generational legacy of service and integrity. King Harold IV ruled for another 15 years after Edmund's death. He never fully shed his guilt about Edmund's imprisonment, but he channeled that guilt into becoming a better ruler, more accountable, more transparent, more willing to admit mistakes and correct them. When he died, the kingdom was in far better shape than when he'd inherited it, a transformation that historians would directly attribute to Edmund's influence. The reforms Edmund had implemented endured, though they required constant maintenance and occasional renewal as new challenges emerged. Future generations of administrators studied his methods and his principles. The honest historical account he'd helped create became required reading, ensuring that the lessons of that era weren't forgotten or sanitized. 50 years after Edmund's death, a young treasury clerk named Marcus, no relation to the general, was reviewing old records for a historical project. He came across Edmund's original arrest warrant, the fabricated evidence that had sent an innocent man to prison for 20 years. Marcus also found Edmund's first reformed budget after his release, with notes in the margins explaining his reasoning, teaching even through documentation. Marcus took both documents to his supervisor, who took them to the current royal treasurer. They decided to frame both documents and hang them side by side in the main treasury office, with a simple placard: "The cost of corruption, the power of redemption." It became a tradition for new treasury clerks to stand before those documents during their first day, to hear the story of Edmund Blackwell, to understand that their work wasn't just about numbers and procedures, but about justice and integrity and the human lives affected by institutional decisions. The kingdom Edmund had returned to find, decaying, corrupt, desperate, continued its transformation across generations. It never achieved perfection. No human institution ever does. But it maintained a culture of accountability and integrity that made widespread corruption difficult and isolated corruption punishable. The cycle Edmund and Harold IV had worked so hard to break remained broken, though it required constant effort to keep it that way. And in the Treasury courtyard, Edmund's monument stood as a permanent reminder. Institutions are fragile. Corruption is persistent, but individuals have the power to demand better. One man, wronged terribly and given every reason to walk away, had chosen instead to fight. His choice had mattered. His work had endured. His legacy had transformed a kingdom. Years became decades, became generations. But the story remained. Children heard it from their parents. Clerks heard it from their supervisors. Kings heard it from their advisors. And each time the story was told, the same questions were asked. What would I do in Edmund's position? Would I have the courage to return? The strength to rebuild? The grace to transform suffering into meaning? Those questions, more than any specific reform or procedure, became Edmund Blackwell's true legacy. Not answers, but questions that challenged each generation to examine their own integrity, their own courage, their own commitment to justice. Questions that remained relevant long after the specific corruption Edmund had fought had been defeated. In the end, Edmund had been right about one thing. Nothing could fully compensate for 20 stolen years. But he'd also been right about something more important. Suffering could be transformed into meaning. Injustice could inspire justice. And one person's choice to demand better could ripple forward through time in ways impossible to fully measure. The elderly man who'd stumbled from a dungeon into sunlight had returned to a broken castle and found not just decay, but opportunity. Opportunity to build, to teach, to transform, to ensure his suffering served a purpose beyond itself. He'd taken that opportunity, and in doing so, he'd changed not just a kingdom's financial systems, but its moral foundation. And that change endured, generation after generation, a testament to the power of integrity over expedience, of courage over comfort, of one man's refusal to let injustice have the final word. The castle Edmund Blackwell had returned to find was broken. The castle he'd helped rebuild stood strong, not because it was perfect, but because it had learned, painfully, slowly, imperfectly, to value truth over convenience, justice over power, and integrity over everything else. That was his true monument. Not the stone carved with his name, but the living institution that continued his work, the people who carried forward his principles, the kingdom that had learned, through his suffering and his service, to be better than it had been. Edmund had spent 20 years in darkness, but the light he'd helped kindle burned bright long after his death, illuminating the path for all who followed.